Snowflakes drifted down gently in the early morning hours of December 2018, covering the quiet streets of Detroit. But in the stillness, in the dim glow of a gas station parking lot, a chilling image took form. A young woman's body lay crumpled in the snow, her life extinguished by a single gunshot. Her name was Kelly Stowe, though to many in her community she was simply Keena. She was only 36 years old. Witnesses would later recall the sight of her motionless figure, her breath frozen in the night air, while just blocks away, the man who had pulled the trigger calmly drove off. Moments later, he would punch in for work, clocking into his shift as if nothing had happened. He wasn't just anyone, he was a church pastor, a man people trusted to guide them toward the light. And so begins a story of betrayal, silence, and a life stolen too soon. But before we reach that terrible morning, we must first step back into Kelly's world. Kelly Stowe had grown up in Detroit, a city often painted with images of grit and survival. To outsiders, Detroit could seem unforgiving: shuttered factories, crumbling buildings, and entire blocks emptied by years of hardship. But to Kelly, it was home. In that concrete landscape, she carved out her own space, her own identity, her own voice. She was unapologetically herself, living as a black transgender woman in a world that too often refused to see her. Friends described her as bold, outspoken, and endlessly creative. Kelly had an eye for beauty not just in clothes or in style, but in people. She was a natural caretaker, someone who listened when others needed to be heard. In her community, she had become known as a stylist, someone who could transform not only how people looked, but how they felt about themselves. She had a way of giving confidence to those who struggled to find it on their own. But behind her laughter, behind the sparkle she carried into every room, Kelly also lived with a quiet awareness of the dangers she faced. Transgender women of color, especially in cities like Detroit, lived with the constant threat of violence. She knew the risks. She had seen it happen to others, and yet, she refused to let fear define her life. She wanted to dream bigger, to one day expand her work, maybe open her own salon, and give back to those who had given so much to her. Her mother, Jessica, remembered her as someone who never forgot to say, "I love you." No matter what struggles she carried, Kelly always wanted her family to know she cared. She wasn't perfect, she faced challenges. She stumbled, like anyone else. But she held on to hope. Hope that the world could be kinder. Hope that she could be seen for who she really was. On the night of December 6th, 2018, Kelly was out, as she often was, navigating the city streets she knew so well. What happened next would shatter her world and expose the darkness in someone else's. That man was Albert Weathers. By all appearances, Weathers lived a double life. By day, he was a 46-year-old pastor, preaching from the pulpit, wearing the cloth of respectability, teaching about sin and redemption. He had a wife, a family, and the reputation of a man dedicated to his faith. But in the shadows, away from the public eye, he sought out encounters that contradicted the image he presented to his congregation. The details of what led him to cross paths with Kelly that night remain clouded. Was it a chance meeting? Was there an exchange that escalated? Or was it something darker, a man lashing out at the very truth he could not face within himself? What we do know is this. Just after 6 a.m., shots rang out. A single bullet pierced the early morning quiet, and Kelly collapsed onto the snow, The silence that followed was deafening. While her body lay cooling in the December air, Weathers slipped back into his car and drove away. His destination? He parked, walked in, and clocked in, as if the act of taking a life could be tucked neatly into the folds of routine. It was a chilling detail that would haunt investigators later. For hours, Kelly's body remained there, a tragic symbol of both violence and indifference. It wasn't until authorities arrived that the weight of what had happened began to sink in. A black transgender woman had been killed, and the circumstances were immediately unsettling. Investigators faced the same question the community would soon be asking. Who could do this to Kelly? Who could look into her face, hear her voice, and still pull the trigger? At first, the trail was murky. Kelly's phone was missing, and with it, the record of her last conversations. But slowly, pieces began to emerge: surveillance cameras, witness accounts, small clues pointing toward a figure moving in the shadows that morning. And when those threads began to tighten, they all led back to one man: Pastor Albert Weathers. His arrest sent shockwaves through Detroit. A pastor, accused of killing a transgender woman. It felt like betrayal on multiple levels, not only to Kelly and her loved ones, but to a community that trusted men like Weathers to uphold morality. How could a man who preached about God's love harbor the capacity for such violence? And yet, the story was only beginning. Because as the investigation unfolded, what emerged was not just a story about one man and one woman on a cold December morning. It was about secrecy, about shame, and about the dangerous consequences when society forces people to hide who they truly are. For Kelly's family, the loss was immediate and devastating. For her community, it was a wound that spoke to a much larger crisis. And for investigators, it was the start of a battle to bring the truth to light, a battle that would take them deep into the hidden corners of both a city and a soul. But here's the question that still lingers, even as we step into the beginning of this story. Did Albert Weathers pull the trigger out of fear, out of hatred, or out of a desperate attempt to silence the truth about himself? The answer may be more unsettling than anyone expected, and this is only the beginning. There's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The crime scene told a story, but it wasn't complete. Snow pressed against Kelly's body like a frozen shroud, her final moments preserved in silence. Police officers moved carefully through the area, their flashlights cutting through the early morning darkness. The question on everyone's mind was simple, but agonizing. Who could have done this? They searched for clues, shell casings, footprints, anything that might shed light on what had happened. But one thing stood out right away. Kelly's phone was gone. For investigators, that detail was like a missing heartbeat. A phone doesn't just disappear. It contains the last calls, the last texts, the last digital footprint of a victim's life. Whoever had taken it wanted to erase something, and that made detectives suspicious. As they canvassed the area, they found a surveillance camera near the gas station, the faint glow of its lens catching activity that night. When they reviewed the footage, a car appeared. It wasn't much, just a vehicle pulling away after the time of the shooting. But it was a thread, and threads, when pulled, often unravel into the truth. Meanwhile, whispers spread quickly in Detroit's LGBTQ community. News of Kelly's death traveled from friend to friend, filling the air with disbelief and fear. This wasn't just another tragedy. It was personal. She was theirs. A sister, a friend, a caretaker. Her death wasn't abstract. It was intimate. And for many transgender women of color, it was terrifyingly familiar. Detroit police understood that urgency. The missing phone, the car in the footage, the timing they needed answers. So they began piecing together the final hours of Kelly's life. That's when they stumbled upon a name that no one expected. Pastor Albert Weathers. It was almost unthinkable. Weathers wasn't some faceless stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a respected man of the cloth, someone who preached sermons about morality and forgiveness. He had a wife. He had a congregation that looked to him for spiritual guidance. On the surface, he seemed the least likely suspect. But suspicion doesn't care about appearances. Detectives started digging. They discovered that Weathers' car matched the description of the vehicle on the surveillance tape. They also learned that, curiously, he had shown up for work that morning as if nothing had happened. He clocked in at his job shortly after Kelly's death, performing his duties with a chilling normalcy that didn't sit right with investigators. The missing phone remained a thorn in their side, but other details began to emerge. Witnesses hinted at seeing Weathers near the scene, and then came the most damning revelation during questioning. Weathers admitted he had been in the area that morning. He tried to spin the story, to frame it as something less sinister, but his words only deepened the suspicion. Behind the scenes, prosecutors weighed the evidence. They knew they were dealing with a case that would not only expose a crime, but also spark a larger conversation about hypocrisy, secrecy, and violence against trans women. If they were going to charge a pastor with murder, they needed to be ready for the storm that would follow. For Kelly's family, the investigation was both a source of hope and heartbreak. Hope, because progress was being made. Heartbreak, because each new detail about her death forced them to relive the loss. Her mother clung to the memory of her daughter's voice, her laugh, the way she always said, "I love you." But the weight of injustice pressed down like a stone. The missing phone became symbolic. It wasn't just a device. It was the silence left behind the voice Kelly could no longer use to tell her side of the story. And in that silence, investigators had to rely on evidence, fragments, and the chilling behavior of a man who seemed determined to walk away as if nothing had happened. What haunted many was the image of Weathers walking into his job that morning, sliding into the rhythm of a workday just after taking a life. How do you reconcile that? How can someone switch off the horror of what they've done with such ease? It painted a picture of a man who wasn't just panicked, but practiced in concealment. As news of his arrest spread, reactions were mixed. His congregation was stunned, some refusing to believe it could be true. Others grappling with the painful reality that the person they trusted most had betrayed them. In Detroit's LGBTQ circles, the arrest confirmed suspicions many had whispered about, that Kelly had been killed, not just by violence, but by hypocrisy. The case gained national attention, raising the uncomfortable truth about the risks trans women of color face every single day. Kelly's death wasn't an isolated act, it was part of a pattern too often ignored until a life is lost. Still, one question loomed. Why? Why would a pastor risk everything? His faith, his family, his freedom to take the life of a woman like Kelly. Was it rage, shame, fear of exposure, or was it something deeper? A conflict between his public image and his private desires. That answer, investigators believed, lay not just in evidence, but in the secrets Albert Weathers tried so desperately to keep hidden. And those secrets were about to come to light. But before we move deeper into the unraveling of this double life, ask yourself, when a person builds their existence on a lie, what happens when that lie collides with the truth? There's much more to uncover, and trust me, what comes next will leave you unsettled. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from weight. At the center sat Albert Weathers, the pastor who now stood accused of murder. He wore the same solemn expression he had worn from the pulpit, but here it no longer carried the authority of faith. Instead, it was the mask of a man whose life and freedom hung in the balance. The trial of Albert Weathers was not just about a crime. It was about a clash between perception and reality. How does a respected pastor end up at the heart of such a brutal act? How does someone who preached about God's love and forgiveness stand accused of taking a young woman's life in the cold of winter? Prosecutors laid out the evidence step by step, their voices measured but piercing. They painted a picture of Weathers' movements on that December morning, how his car was seen near the gas station, how he admitted to being in the area, how Kelly's phone had mysteriously vanished. They showed the chilling fact that he clocked in for work less than an hour after the gunshot echoed across the snow. To them, these weren't coincidences. They were patterns of guilt. The defense tried to twist the narrative, suggesting alternative explanations. They hinted at self-defense, at misunderstandings, at the chaos of Detroit's streets. They leaned on the pastor's image, a man of God, a family man, someone whose life, they argued, had been dedicated to good. Could such a man truly be capable of murder? They wanted the jury to hesitate, to doubt. But then came the testimony, raw, emotional, undeniable. Kelly's family took the stand. Her mother, her loved ones, each voice cracking with pain, spoke of who she was beyond the headlines. They reminded the jury that Kelly wasn't just a name in a police report. She was a daughter, a friend, someone with dreams, someone who deserved to grow old. Their grief filled the room, forcing everyone to see the hole her absence left behind. And it wasn't just her family. Members of Detroit's LGBTQ community came forward, demanding that Kelly's life be treated with the dignity she had been denied in her death. They knew too well how cases like hers were often brushed aside, how trans women of color were dehumanized even in death. But this time, they refused to let her name be forgotten. Their presence in the courtroom was a shield, a reminder that justice for Kelly was justice for them all. The prosecutors leaned heavily on one haunting fact. Albert Weathers had choices. He could have walked away. He could have sought help. Instead, he pulled a trigger and left Kelly to die in the snow. That choice, they argued, spoke louder than any sermon he had ever preached. As the trial dragged on, one detail returned again and again: the missing phone. Where was it? What secrets did it hold? Could it have revealed the truth about Kelly's last moments, her last words, her final contact with Weathers? The absence of that phone became a presence of its own, a ghost in the courtroom that no one could ignore. The jury listened, faces tight with concentration, as both sides delivered their closing arguments. For the prosecution, it was simple. Kelly had been killed, and the man who killed her tried to walk away without consequence. For the defense, it was a plea for doubt, for hesitation, for the possibility that things weren't as clear-cut as they seemed. And then, the jury left to deliberate. Hours turned into tension, minutes into silence. For Kelly's family, every second felt like an eternity. Would the system see her life as worth fighting for, or would another Black trans woman's death be swept aside, reduced to a statistic? When the jury returned, the air in the courtroom shifted. People leaned forward, hearts pounding. The foreperson stood, voice steady, but heavy with finality. The verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. A wave of emotion broke across the room. Relief, sorrow, anger, all crashing together. Kelly's family wept, holding each other tightly. Some in the community cried out, not just for Kelly, but for every trans woman who had been silenced. And Albert Weathers? He sat motionless, the mask finally cracking as the reality of a life sentence began to sink in. The judge's words sealed his fate. Weathers would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the walls of a prison replacing the pews of his church. It was a moment that carried the weight of justice, but also the heavy reminder that justice had come too late for Kelly herself. Still, questions lingered. What drove Weathers that night? Was it fear of exposure? Was it hatred turned inward, projected outward? Or was it the simple cruelty of a man who thought he could silence the truth? For many, the verdict was not the end, but the beginning of another reckoning. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable that someone entrusted with spiritual care had chosen violence instead. It forced a city to ask how many more Kellys would be lost before change came. And it forced all of us, watching from outside those courtroom walls, to grapple with the same haunting question. How do you reconcile the image of a pastor with the reality of a killer? The answer may not lie in the verdict, but in what came after, in the vigils, the grief, the resilience of a community that refused to let Kelly's name fade. But what do vigils and memorials really mean when the violence never stops? That's where the story goes next. And trust me, it's not over yet. If you want to see how a community turned its pain into resistance, don't forget to subscribe, because the aftermath of Kelly's death will leave you questioning everything. In the days after the guilty verdict, Detroit's winter streets carried a strange mix of silence and sound. Silence, because one voice had been stolen: Kelly's, gone forever. And sound, because the people she left behind refused to let that silence define her. On a frigid December evening, candles flickered along a sidewalk where mourners gathered. They lit the night in Kelly's name, their small flames forming a circle of warmth against the cold. Some held signs, others held hands, but all of them held grief. They spoke her name aloud, refusing to let it vanish into court transcripts and headlines. Kelly Stowe, they repeated, as though speaking it could keep her spirit close. For her mother, Jessica, every vigil was both a comfort and a wound. She remembered Kelly's laughter, her vibrant energy, the way she always said, "I love you." Now, those memories had to stand in place of her presence. Jessica wept openly, surrounded by strangers who had become allies, their shared sorrow stitching them into something resembling family. The vigils weren't just about mourning, they were about resistance. For Detroit's LGBTQ community, Kelly's death was another brutal reminder of the dangers they lived with daily. Transgender women of color, especially, bore the brunt of violence, and too often, their deaths were ignored or dismissed. But not this time. Not with Kelly. Her community rallied, demanding recognition, demanding justice beyond the courtroom. They asked the hard questions. Why are Black trans women so often targets? Why are their lives seen as disposable? Why do their killers think they can walk away unnoticed, unpunished? Kelly's story was personal, but it was also painfully universal. She was one name among too many, her face one of countless faces lost to violence. Journalists began to cover the case not just as a local tragedy, but as part of a national crisis. Reports highlighted the staggering statistics. Dozens of transgender women murdered each year, the majority of them black. Advocates used Kelly's name to shine a spotlight on the epidemic of violence, hoping her story might spark the change that so many others had not. And yet, alongside the outrage, there was fatigue. Some in the community whispered their frustration. How many more vigils could they hold? How many more candles could they light before the flames blurred together into an endless line of loss? For every Kelly, there were others whose names never reached the news, whose deaths were brushed aside or misgendered in police reports. The fight for justice was never-ending, and grief was a heavy fuel. Still, the community showed up. They stood together outside churches, on street corners, in parks, their voices echoing against the cold night air. They prayed, they sang, they told stories about Kelly's life. One friend remembered how she could make anyone feel beautiful. Another recalled her sharp wit, the way she could turn a hard day into laughter. These stories painted her not as a statistic, but as a person vibrant, flawed, human, worthy of love and protection. Meanwhile, the broader city of Detroit wrestled with its own reflection. A pastor had been unmasked as a killer. The very role meant to represent compassion had instead concealed violence. For some, this shattered faith in institutions they had once trusted. For others, it was confirmation of what they already knew: that appearances could not be trusted, that the most dangerous men sometimes hid behind the most polished facades. Kelly's death forced conversations in living rooms, in churches, in city halls. People debated responsibility, morality, and the silence that allows violence to thrive. Some asked, had Weathers acted alone in his cruelty? Or was he shaped by a culture that punished honesty, that forced people into double lives and dangerous lies? Through it all, Kelly's family pressed on. They held to each other, leaning on faith even as faith had betrayed them. They spoke her name in interviews, in gatherings, in quiet moments at home. They refused to let her memory dissolve, but the weight of loss was unrelenting. For Jessica, every day without her daughter was a day stolen. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays arrived with an empty chair. She had watched justice play out in a courtroom, but it didn't bring her child back. It never could. The vigils continued, each one a reminder that Kelly's life mattered, that she was loved, that she had been taken unjustly. But beneath the candles and the prayers lay a haunting truth. Until the violence stopped, until society truly valued lives like Kelly's, there would be more vigils, more names, more silence broken by grief. And that leaves us with a question. How much loss does it take before silence finally shatters into change? The story isn't over, because Kelly's legacy isn't only in her death, it's in the fight that followed, and the voices that rose in her name. And trust me, what comes next will stay with you. If you want to see how her legacy turned into a call to action, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Kelly Stove's murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one woven from fear, hate, and silence. To understand the weight of her story, we need to look beyond Detroit, beyond one courtroom, and see the devastating truth. For Black transgender women in America, Violence is not the exception. It is the shadow that follows them every day. In the year Kelly was killed, the Human Rights Campaign reported more than 25 murders of transgender people across the United States. Most of them were women. Most of them were black. And those were just the cases recorded. The names that didn't slip through the cracks of police reports that misgendered victims or ignored them altogether. For every story like Kelly's that reached the news, there were others that never left the margins. The pattern is chilling. Transgender women, especially women of color, are attacked at rates far higher than the general population. They are beaten, abandoned, and, too often, murdered. Their deaths rarely make national headlines. Their killers often believe and sometimes prove that society will look the other way. And why wouldn't they think that? For decades, so many have. Behind the statistics are lives lived under constant risk. Imagine walking through the world, knowing that simply existing in your own truth could make you a target. Imagine carrying yourself with dignity, knowing that someone else's disgust, fear, or shame could one day cost you everything. That was Kelly's reality. And it is still the reality for countless others. And here's the brutal irony. Many victims are not killed by strangers. They are killed by acquaintances, partners, or, as in Kelly's case, men who sought them out in secret. These men lived double lives, pursuing relationships they refused to acknowledge publicly. When their secrets threatened to surface, violence became their way of erasing the truth. This raises questions that cut deep. What is it about honesty that terrifies some people so much? Why does society teach men that their shame is more important than someone else's life? And why do so many systems, legal, cultural, religious, reinforce those deadly beliefs? Kelly's case exposed the hypocrisy starkly. Her killer, a pastor, had built his reputation on morality. He preached about sin and salvation while carrying a secret he would rather destroy than reveal. For him, Kelly's life was disposable. But his actions revealed more than his personal failure. They revealed the dangerous weight of stigma, the way silence festers into violence. For advocates, Kelly's story became part of a rallying cry. Organizations highlighted her name in reports and vigils across the country. They pushed for stronger protections, more accurate reporting, and public acknowledgement that this violence is not random, it is targeted, it is systemic. But advocacy alone isn't enough. Change requires more than statistics and speeches. It requires a cultural shift, one that challenges deep-seated prejudices, one that forces society to see transgender women not as shadows or secrets, but as human beings deserving of safety and love. And yet, progress feels slow, too slow. Even after Kelly's death, the murders continued. In the years that followed, names like Muhlaysia Booker, B. Love Slater, and Nikki Kuhnhausen joined the list of lives stolen. Each one sparked a moment of outrage, but moments fade. The cycle of violence persisted. Communities fight back in the ways they can. They organize, they educate, they demand that police and media honor victims' identities. They insist that these women be remembered as they truly were, not as mischaracterized footnotes. But the struggle is exhausting, and the danger never seems to end. For Kelly's loved ones, this fight is both global and deeply personal. Her family doesn't just see her as a statistic. They see her as the child they raised, the woman they loved, the voice that filled their home. When they speak her name at marches or vigils, it's not abstract. It's grief sharpened into activism. They want justice not just for Kelly, but for every woman like her. And so we're left with a haunting question. How many more names must be added to the list before the violence stops being tolerated? Because here's the truth. The danger Kelly faced didn't come only from one man with a gun. It came from a society that allowed her to be vulnerable in the first place. A society that shrugged at the deaths of women like her. A society that forced people into closets so dark that lies turned deadly. Kelly's death was one tragedy, but it was also a mirror. And when we look into it, what do we see? A culture that punishes honesty. A justice system that often fails the most vulnerable, and a silence that lingers, heavy and unbroken. But here's where her story turns. Because even in death, Kelly refused to be invisible. Her name was spoken. Her life was honored. Her story continues to echo, forcing us to confront questions we might rather avoid. And that brings us to the final chapter. Because while the statistics paint a grim picture, there is also something else: resilience. A community that refuses to give up. Families that refuse to stay silent. Voices that refuse to be erased. The question is, will we listen? Stay with me, because in part 1, we'll explore the true meaning of Kelly's legacy, the lessons she left behind, the people who fought for her, and the lasting impact of a life ended too soon, but will never be forgotten. The courtroom had fallen silent when the verdict was read. For Kelly Stove's family, the words carried both relief and sorrow. Guilty. The man who had once stood in a pulpit, preaching about morality and redemption, was now condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Justice, at least on paper, had been served. But justice is a strange word in cases like this, because how do you measure it? A guilty verdict doesn't bring back a daughter. It doesn't fill the empty chair at the dinner table. It doesn't silence the nightmares or replace the voice they'll never hear again. For Kelly's mother, her sister, and everyone who loved her, justice is bittersweet at best. The truth is, the only true justice would be for Kelly to still be alive. And yet, even in her absence, Kelly's life continues to ripple outward. The tragedy of her death ignited something larger than one courtroom battle. It gave a name, a face, and a story to a struggle too many people ignore. It forced people to look at the violence that stalks Black transgender women in America and ask why, decade after decade, it continues unchecked. In the months following the trial, vigils were held across Detroit. Candles flickered against the winter night, hands clasped together, voices chanting Kelly's name. At one gathering, her family spoke through tears. They didn't just talk about how she died, they talked about how she lived. How she laughed so loud it filled every room. How she styled hair with patience and pride, transforming clients not just outwardly but inwardly. How she carried herself with courage, even when the world tried to push her into silence. These memories, spoken aloud, became acts of resistance. They reclaimed Kelly's humanity from the headlines that too often strip victims down to statistics. They reminded the world that she was not just another transgender woman murdered, but a daughter, a sister, a friend, a dreamer. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy Kelly leaves behind: the insistence on visibility. To live openly as a Black transgender woman in America is an act of defiance in itself. To be remembered fully, truthfully, and lovingly, that is a legacy no act of violence can erase. Still, the haunting questions remain. How many more vigils must be held? How many more families must stand trembling in courtrooms, praying for guilty verdicts before something changes? Why is the burden always on the grieving to demand the justice they should never have had to seek in the first place? Kelly's story forces us to face the silence that surrounds so much of this violence. Silence in the media when stories are buried or misreported. Silence in communities when prejudice festers unchallenged. Silence in families when shame and secrecy weigh heavier than love. Silence in the halls of power when lawmakers look away. But silence can be broken. Kelly's mother has spoken of her daughter's courage, how she refused to live in hiding, how she claimed her truth boldly. That kind of courage is contagious. It has inspired activists, friends, and strangers alike to raise their voices louder. To demand better reporting, to demand accountability, to demand that Black transgender women no longer live and die in the shadows. And that's where we find ourselves now, in the space between tragedy and change. Kelly is gone, but her name is still spoken. Her story is still told. And every time it is, another piece of silence shatters. There's a haunting image that lingers when thinking about Kelly's final moments. The cold Detroit street, the sound of a gunshot, the weight of a secret too heavy to bear. But there is another image too, one that should live just as vividly. Kelly behind a salon chair, smiling, holding scissors like magic wands, helping people see themselves more clearly. Kelly walking into her mother's home, laughing, her presence filling every corner. Kelly living fully and unapologetically. In the end, this is where her legacy resides, not in the violence that took her, but in the courage that defined her. She showed the world who she was, without apology. And for that, she will be remembered not as a victim, but as a voice. The final question is this: what will we do with her voice? Will we let it fade into another statistic, another headline forgotten? Or will we carry it forward, letting it guide us to a world where no one has to live in fear for telling the truth of who they are? That's the responsibility her story leaves behind. It doesn't rest only on her family or on activists. It rests on all of us. Because the violence Kelly faced wasn't born in a vacuum, it was born in silence, and silence belongs to everyone who chooses to look away. So the next time you hear a name like Kelly's whispered at a vigil, printed in a report, spoken in a courtroom, remember that behind it was a life as full, as vibrant, and as worthy as any other. Remember that silence is not neutral. And remember that to honor her is to refuse to look away. Because Kelly's story is not just hers. It's a warning, a call, and a haunting echo, and it will not be silenced.